But also, and then also, but once we start, in terms of good afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Rick Hess, Director of Education Policy Studies here at AEI. Delighted to have you all with us today for today's event, Cage Busting Teachers. Who are they and what can they teach us? The event is key to the release of my new book, The Cage Busting Teacher. It is officially out in a week and a half from Harvard Education Press, but we have it for sale free in the foyer here. You can find it online at Amazon. Hope you will check it out. Look forward to hearing from you as far as your thoughts and reactions. More interesting than the book itself, though, is I think the phenomenal lineup of folks we've got with us today to have a conversation about what it really means for teachers to take the lead in terms of creating great schools and great classrooms that do a phenomenal job of serving kids, of developing their skills, their talents, their abilities, and of making schools a place that kids want to be, feel safe, and where learning is something that is rich and robust and not just a question of whether or not we're hitting some numbers that we think we need to hit. So I'm excited about it. We're going to use a slightly unusual format for the event. We're going to take a first half hour, and I'm going to have a chance to have a conversation with my dear friend, Maddie Fennell. Many of you in this room know Maddie. Maddie has spent a quarter century now as an elementary school teacher. She was Nebraska Teacher of the Year in 2007. She is nationally board certified. She was the former chair of the NEA Commission on Effective Teachers and Teaching. She is also a second-year U.S. Department of Education Classroom Teaching Ambassador Fellow. Normally it's a one-year position, but once people get a hold of Maddie, they don't want to let her go. Many of you in this town will know Maddie is the moving spirit behind Teach to Lead, the U.S. Department of Education's initiative, in which Secretary Duncan has, I think, done an admirable job of putting the spotlight on the people who are doing the work. Maddie is going to be our MC for the day. I'm going to hand that over to her right now. Maddie.
Now is it on? Now it's on. Although with my teacher voice, I really don't need a microphone. And any of you in here who know me know that I could probably reach over to the next several buildings and still be fine. But so Rick and I have talked a lot about this book. I was one of the folks that he interviewed for the book. And of course, this is really what my life's work has been about. Although you're going to so owe me for mentioning it's a quarter of a century. It really sounds better saying I've taught 25 years than I've taught a quarter of a century. But one of the things that I found interesting is the fact that you've already written a book about cage busting. So why did you write another one? Besides just to make more money off royalties. Why did you write another one?
It's funny. I wrote this book a couple years ago called Cage Busting Leadership, really with an emphasis on what superintendents and principals can do. Because over the years, I had spent an enormous amount of time interacting with administrators who had terrific ideas, said, we would love to do X and we can't. And I was astonished how often it turned out they actually could. They just didn't know they could. And so I had come to thinking about them as living in cages of their own design, and cage busting leadership was how do you get out of those cages you've put around yourself. Problem was, as I was going around, the book's done pretty well and been pretty successful. But as I'd go around and talk to principals and superintendents, there were often teacher leaders of various kinds in the room, and they would come up and they'd say, Rick, some of these ideas are reasonably interesting, but the book's totally unhelpful. And I'd say, why is the book unhelpful? And they'd say, because the stuff you're talking about, what I learned over time is the stuff I was talking about was stuff you need positional authority to do. You need to be in a position where you can move dollars, where you can create job titles. The DNA of cage busting applied to teachers, but teachers actually have a different kind of authority than administrators. And so I wrote this book because in talking to a couple hundred teacher leaders about what were they doing and where they get frustrated and how do they do it, I understood that the kinds of authority they have are real different from the kinds of authority that administrators have.
So what is that? Because I understand that, because too often I hear so many of my colleagues say, I'm just a teacher, which lowers us on the rung of authority. So then what kind of authority should teachers be exercising?
So the first thing is nobody should say that, right? Nobody says, I'm just a surgeon. Boy, I wish I was a hospital administrator. Educators are the people who do the work in schools. And we need to remember that. And policy, to my mind, is about asking educators to be accountable for whether they're serving the kids well, but then empowering educators and families to actually make sure kids are well served. Teachers have two kinds of authority. The first is teachers are the people who actually know where rubber hits the road. So those of us in the Beltway and the 10th floor of DC office buildings, we have interesting ideas, and we don't necessarily know a whole lot about how those ideas play out in practice, whether it's teacher observations or new assessments or anything else. Teachers are the ones who actually experience and see this, and they need to do an effective job of communicating that expertise in a way that informs these decisions. They've often not done a very good job of that. Second source of authority is teachers, like any other professionals, have this potentially enormous moral authority. We want to trust that cops know the best way to police our streets. We want to trust that the military knows the best way to safeguard the country. People are really eager to trust professionals, but they want to be confident those professionals are going to do the right thing with the trust. And teachers have not always done a good job of safeguarding that professional authority.
So how do we as teachers, I want to take the first one that you talked about, because what I heard you saying was that teachers need to be able to translate what they do to policymakers. But we often feel like that's an enormous divide. And in fact, when I came in, one of the reasons I went to the Department of Ed was I did not know how to speak policy. And I felt, because I feel it's a totally foreign language. So how does someone who's, in their classroom teaching high school science or third grade math learn how to speak policy or how to get that done?
So the first thing is you don't need to. Second thing is what teachers ought to focus on is not worrying about policy. They should focus on the things that make it harder for them to do their job well. That means teachers ought to focus on identifying problems. They ought to focus not just on complaining about them, but on offering solutions, alternatives, ways to do it better. And then they need to understand that administrators and policymakers care about kids. Nobody gets elected to a school board to say, man, I'm going to get revenge on teachers. Or at least very few of them.
I was going to say, I might know one or two, but that's okay.
Most people, and in my experience, everybody who is advocating around education, who is trying to make policy around education, has in their mind that they're trying to do this because they think it's going to serve kids better. So when teachers speak up by thinking people are evil, by implying that people are only interested in education to make money off of kids, what they are doing is they are alienating people who might otherwise listen to them. So the third thing is if teachers have identified problems, have offered solutions, and are willing to accept that people who disagree also are trying to do the right thing for kids, then they can actually start talking to leaders and policymakers in a constructive way. And if they do that, they'll find there's lots of intermediaries. This can be your associations and unions. It can be groups like Teach Plus or Hope Street Group or Odell Teachers Council or Educators for Excellence or Leading Educators or any number of organizations that exist, or National Network of State Teachers of the Year, any number of organizations that exist to try to help bridge that gap between teachers who have ideas about how to solve problems and how to translate that in a way that policymakers and advocates will hear it. Teachers don't need to do all that work themselves. What they do need to do is bring concrete, identifiable suggestions, and they need to do it with respect for other folks who are also trying to do the right thing.
So you mentioned that you did a lot of research for this book, and it's really quite amazing how many really outstanding teacher leaders around the country. It's kind of a who's who in teacher leadership in your book. What surprised you the most as you were doing your research? What did teachers say that you were like, wow?
One of the key things for me is if you're going to do a book like this, you really need phenomenally smart young people to do all your work for you. So one of the advantages for me is I had two folks who just did a ton of work with me on this, Max Eden and Sarah Dupree on my team here, who just deserve a huge shout out for all of the assistance.
Yay.
But one of the things, so I had a chance to interview 200 or 300 teacher leaders of various stripes, teachers of the year and unsung teacher leaders, and folks in the associations and folks in schools of education and folks who are in this space. And the thing that surprised me most was how often I would speak to people who were accomplished, recognized. Everybody would just talk about them as, oh, you've got to talk to this person because they just knock it out of the park. And how often they felt stymied. They were sitting in school until 10 o'clock at night, grading papers because they had spent all afternoon mentoring kids, and they couldn't even mentor on campus because the campus doesn't have security to actually allow kids to visit. They were spending Saturday mornings writing grant applications to get $400 to buy materials. They were figuring out, well, this was just taken as part of what is expected. Exceptional work was not thought to be, oh, they ought to be setting me up in a way that I can do more exceptional work. It's simply that my job is to figure out how within this cage that exists around me, I can grind out as much of this as possible. And I think what that does is it wears down teachers, it frustrates teachers, and it soaks up time and energy that could be spent serving kids or mentoring colleagues in a whole bunch of tedious tasks that don't actually add a lot of value to the country or the kids.
Well, and I know a lot of really great teachers who it was a good thing that they, me included, good thing I was a member of the union, because the same things that I was honored for doing, cage busting, teacher of the year, we're going to honor you for doing this, were the exact same things the year before my principal wanted to kick me out of the building for. And so that's one of the things that concerns me, is that often the people that we're talking about, they're considered the outliers or they're the standalones. In your work, did you find any systems that were systemically going about trying to create and include teacher leadership as a part of a working system?
So I think part of the trick is teacher leadership is such a mushy phrase that, so there's whole states now that are saying we need to have lots of teacher leaders across the state. We don't know what these leaders are. We don't know who they should be, but we should call somebody a leader. So I think partly it's what do we mean by leadership? And so for me, a cage busting teacher is leadership, but it's not synonymous with leadership. This is teachers who say, look, I am going to try to create the schools and systems where I can do my best work. Not just do my best work, but create schools and systems where I can do my best work. This matters. Why does it matter? Because if teachers were like psychiatrists who had a home office, if you just had your coffee in the morning, put on your sweater, went down, hung up your shingle and did it, it wouldn't actually matter how schools work because it would just be you in isolation. But teachers exist in schools. Schools which have strong disciplinary norms make it easier to serve your kids well. Schools which have lousy discipline make it harder. Schools which have a lousy routine for covering substitute teachers wind up pulling highly accomplished, nationally recognized Milken teachers out of their prep periods to go sit and watch somebody else's class because they don't have their substitute act together. Other school systems, this stuff runs smoothly, and teachers report that actually missing a day is much less impactful than it was in previous teaching environments. So schools matter. But what happens is we have taught our teachers that all of that stuff's a frustration, it's another language, it's a bunch of people who don't care about you. So what they do is they close the door, they retreat to the four walls of that classroom cage, and they try to wait stuff out. So what's teacher leader? Teacher leader is not doing that and then saying, I am now going to spend my weekend going to the state capitol to march around and spend time in boring meetings with staff, with legislative staff, having aimless conversations about somebody else's agenda. That, to me, is not real leadership, although I fear that's often too much what teachers wind up getting signed up for. For me, leadership is saying, what are those things that happen in the school that are wasting your time, that are draining your energy, that are wasting your passion? How can that school use PD much more effectively? Why does that PLC feel like such a drag instead of a support of your practice? What would it look like for meetings to be something that actually feel painless rather than painful? And then what do you have to do to change those things at your school? And now as you go up the ladder, what you'll realize is some of this stuff is just bad culture and practice at a school. Some of this stuff is a product of bad practice at the district. Some of it's a result of dumb policy or problematic implementation at the state or federal level. And I think for me, teacher leadership is not just speaking out or not just being in charge of things. Teacher leadership is playing a role where you're solving the problems at the school that can be solved there. When you can't solve them there, learning how to communicate, coordinate, speak at that district level. When they can't be addressed there, learning how to weigh into policy.
Right. It's multiple levels of getting this done. I think about the Teaching Ambassador Fellows at the Department of Ed, and we wouldn't have Teach to Lead if the Teaching Ambassador Fellows weren't in there saying we need to be doing more around giving teachers the vehicles they need in which to solve their problems. Because we tell people to go out and solve problems, but we also haven't trained teachers how to go through logic models and how to actually analyze. When we did our first Teach to Lead summit in Kentucky, our critical friend said, you got a lot of teachers here who have a lot of solutions. They don't know what the problem is. And that the problem was that they were dealing with their day-to-day and hadn't had a time or the energy or the ability to focus on something else. You know, one of I have a favorite quote in your book, and it's on page 32, if anyone cares to look. And it was from Ted Kildare about the New Deal with teachers. That really struck home with me. Because one of the things that teachers are really arguing about is this whole piece around autonomy and accountability. And we really feel like right now we're being given no autonomy and complete accountability. Do everything, make it all work, but we're not going to give you all the resources we need. We're not going to give you all the time we need. And he puts that in a new frame. How does teacher leadership help us frame the fact that teachers deserve both autonomy, but then we have to accept the accountability that comes with that?
Yeah, and I think that's great. I mean, so one, Ted's a smart guy, and so it is a great quote. Look, I don't think nobody deserves autonomy. We're seeing this with with police across the U.S. right now, for instance, when it comes to body cameras. Police aren't necessarily enthused about the idea that they are going to be asked to wear body cameras at all the time, and all this footage will potentially be public. But there's this balance. When you're a public servant, when you're paid with public funds to do a public job, we have to strike this balance of we want the professionals to weigh in and we want to value their opinion, but we all expect them to perform a public service. So there's this balancing act. So the police don't deserve to get to decide how this happens, but they can earn a powerful seat at that table. They earn that seat at the table by convincing us that they've got our best interest at heart, that they are safeguarding our communities, that they are making good judgments, that they are taking care to keep an eye out for the folks at the bottom of the spectrum who we think are doing wrong by us or by particular communities. Same exact logic applies to teachers. Teachers need to earn that seat at the table. They need to earn that autonomy. They earn that autonomy by convincing the public that they have a clear sense of what it means to educate children well, to articulate that in clear ways, to explain how the public can be confident that children are going to be well served, and convincing the public that they know there are some teachers, maybe just a handful, probably 5% or more. How do I know that? Because teachers will tell you that 5% of the teachers in their district deserve enough. I got to tell you, probably 5% of people in think tanks deserve enough, and I could well be one of them. By making it clear that they're aware that there are some people who aren't serving the children well and that they need to be addressed. If teachers do these things, they have then earned that right to help shape how we ought to frame schools, set policy for schools, organize schools. So the thing is, it's not even a balance between autonomy and accountability. It's that one earns autonomy by convincing the public that they're accountable.
Okay. All right, I get that. So one last question before we move on to our panel. How does a classroom teacher sitting in a classroom, how should they be reading your book to make themselves a better educator, to be able to strike that new agreement? How can this book help them get there?
So, I mean, the first thing is to keep in mind that this is not some new theory of how you teach kids. I work in the 10th floor of a DC office building. There's nobody who has less right to tell folks about scope and sequence or curriculum and instruction. I mean, I haven't been in front of a K-12 classroom since the last century. So I try to be appropriately humble there. So if teachers want advice on instructional practice, I don't pretend to be giving it to them. This is not some theory of how you do that. However, when you're tackling your instructional practice, you're doing it, again, not as a psychiatrist in a home office, but as part of a school or a system. And teachers know better than anybody how those schools and systems can make it easier for them to do their best work or make it harder for them to do their best work. So what I want teachers to read this book as is a complement to everything they read on instructional leadership, on instructional practice. Because one of the things, and a second thing that surprised me as we did the research on this book, was how little there is out there on how teachers can change schools and systems. Even books that seem like they would make sense. Teaching as Leadership by Steve Farr, a terrific book, isn't actually as teachers as leaders in their buildings. It's how do teachers use a leadership mindset to serve children well in their classrooms. That's great. I got no problem with that. But we also have got to equip teachers to be leaders beyond the classroom. So I want teachers to say, I need to be responsible for creating a place where I can do my best work, and I want them not to be intimidated, because it's not cage busting if it's one more thing you need to do. It's not cage busting if, oh, it's one more committee you're supposed to sit on. Or, oh, you're not supposed to actually be able to put your kid to bed this weekend because you need to fly up and hang out with legislators in the Capitol. It's cage busting when teachers identify the things that stop them from doing their best work, come up with better solutions that they can share with colleagues or administrators or policymakers, and find constructive ways to push those solutions so that they have more time, passion, and energy to do the stuff that they're in their classroom to do.
Great, wonderful. Well, we've heard your wonderful words of wisdom, and now we have some even smarter people who are going to come up and share their words of wisdom. Can we have all our panelists come on up, and then I'll introduce you, please? So with us today, we have a wonderful group of people who are leading and who are helping teachers lead. And we're going to start with introducing Evan Stone. Evan is the co-founder and co-CEO of Educators for Excellence. He was recognized in Forbes for the 30 under 30 in education. And he was previously a sixth grade teacher in the Bronx through Teach for America. And I love the story in the book about how you got a team of teachers together to meet a student's needs, which is so true. I just thought that was fantastic. Irvin Scott is Deputy Director of College Ready Programming at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Before joining the foundation, he was the Chief Academic Officer for the Boston Public Schools. And previously, he served as both an English teacher and principal of J.P. McCaskey and McCaskey East High Schools in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And he's best known among teachers for his catchphrase, which is, shout out. If you ever go to an ESET too, it's all about shout out. Marilyn Rames, she's taught in district and charter schools in Chicago for the past 11 years. She authors Education Week blog, Charting My Course. In 2011, she founded the Christian nonprofit Teachers Who Pray, and she's got a wonderful story she's going to tell us about how she got her African-American boys to do, and Latino boys, to do more in reading, which we know is a very underserved area. Jason Camrus is one of my fellow State Teachers of the Year. He was actually also, though, a National Teacher of the Year in 2005. He is a Chief of Human Capital for the District of Columbia Public Schools. Before joining the central office there, he began teaching as a member of Teach for America and taught math at John Philip Sousa Middle School in D.C. for 8 years. Thank you for being here today. And Lily Eskelson Garcia is one of my buddies from NEA, a wonderful leader in the NEA. I just don't even have to really read this. She began her career as a school lunch lady. Then she went to the classroom and then was Utah Teacher of the Year before becoming the Utah Education Association president. And she was just elected this summer to lead the National Education Association. So thank you all for being here today. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us. So I want to pitch the first question, and then Rick might pitch a question to you also. But here's mine. So I'm worried that teacher leadership is going to become the latest buzz phrase, right? Let's now use teacher leadership. Why do we really need it? How do we really make it real? Anybody?
Right button. Yay, I love to hear the sound of my own voice. This is great. It already is real. We're just looking, how do you organize it? I liked reading the book, and surprise, I liked reading one of your books, Rick. I want brownie points for that.
There's always a first time.
But the reason I loved it because I think all of us that were up here that were in classrooms, there was something magical about going, I've got this amazing idea. For me, it wasn't so much solving a problem. It was just having I know what we could do. Where I was teaching sixth grade, because that's the best grade, it was me having an idea in my classroom. I could close the door. I started teaching in the 80s where it was wonderful that nobody actually was looking at what you were doing. But it didn't necessarily impact the whole school. That I found some way to get my kids to really love science and be talking about science or social studies or writing poetry or whatever it is that we were doing. And it wasn't until you open that door and you walk across the hall and you take a risk and you say, Sue, how would you like to do this with me? The leadership part, it's not just having a great idea or being a great problem solver. The leadership part says you can take it outside your own classroom
Right.
and inspire someone else who doesn't have to do that, for them to see the possibilities of, oh my God, they would love this. Yeah, let's get this together. The parents would be involved. And you're able to reach out across your own isolation. And that, to me, is where the secret sauce is. We can find little campfires of excellence all over, and how do you make that a brush fire? How do you say the people who actually can, light these kids' hair on fire, those practitioners in the classroom, how do you connect them when the institutions that we have right now encourage us to close our doors and be isolated individuals who maybe do some fabulous things, but it'll never grow. That teacher leaves that school, and it leaves with her.
So, page 90, love the point Lily just made, and actually Rick alluded to this a little earlier. Page 90 in the book, policy is a crude tool. Why do we need it? Because I love the sentence, policymakers can make people do things, but they can't make them do them well, right? So you create policies, and there are a lot of policies, a lot of policies have been flying around lately. Be transparent. We're strong advocates of a lot of those policies around Common Core implementation, around teacher effectiveness. So those policies exist, but they become real in the classroom for teachers on a day-to-day basis. And if those policies are going to, if we're going to realize the full potential of those policies, it won't happen without teachers. And it won't happen without teachers leading the conversation around them. So I think that's one of the reasons why it's needed, because policy, to the point, is a crude tool. The thing around how do we actually make it happen, the one concern that I have, and you sort of alluded to it when you were talking about how do teachers lead, how do they teach, and have a life at the same time. If we're not careful, will there be a lot of momentum around teachers? You have a bunch of teachers running around leading and simultaneously trying to be a phenomenal practitioner in a classroom and simultaneously trying to have a wonderful home, and they'll just be burned out, right? So I think if we're going to have this become more than just a fad for the day, we have to figure out how to structurally develop positions for teachers to lead in the classroom while they teach, lead in the school while they simultaneously teach. So hybrid roles is something that people talk a lot about, where you're both in the classroom, you have credibility with teachers, you're staying connected to that classroom, but at the same time not having to lead on the weekend, not having to lead at 11 and 12 o'clock at night, but it's actually built into your day.
So, Jason, that kind of gets me to you, because you're a system leader. So what do you think that you're doing as a system leader that's making that happen already? Or not?
Yeah. Yes. Well, first off, good afternoon, everyone. To answer the question, I think both of you raised this point that, and I think Ricky raised this point in the book, that you can't expect teachers to do everything that they've been asked to do, and then also on the side be a legislator and a principal and a rebel rouser and all that sort of thing. And frankly, I don't think that's what most teachers aspire to do. In fact, I think most high-performing folks are just looking to have a say in what happens in terms of their school and in their district to help be able to shape that and to be able to leverage their strengths and play a slightly greater role, but not totally leave the classroom. And so one of the things that we have done in the DC public schools is through a partnership with leading educators, have developed a number of hybrid teaching roles. So teachers have some part-time release to be able to be perhaps a coach, perhaps a curriculum specialist, or play some other role in their school that would be helpful. Now, this is a little bit different from sort of, I think, Rick's conception of just whatever situation you're in, knock down the walls and think about how to do it differently. And I think that's important too. But at the same time, I think what this has allowed us to do, and we now have roughly 100 of these folks in the school system, is to formalize these opportunities and to say, we know this is a lot, and we know you're looking to do more, but we also know you're not looking to leave. And so here's an opportunity. Here's a mechanism to be able to do that. And here's where I think some of your notions of cage busting come in. In these hybrid roles, and we haven't been super specific about it has to look like this or it has to look like this, the teachers are developing what these roles should be. And out of that, they're coming up with better ways of coaching in the building rather than just having the coach. They're coming up with better ways of training teachers and supporting teachers. And so that's where I think the cage busting is really powerful. And then we're going to be able to perhaps formalize some of that in policy and create these new positions based on the great work that the teachers are doing.
So one of the things that my boss, one of my bosses, Arnie Duncan, has said recently is that, we know teacher voices have to be at the table, but if no one invites you to the table, make your own table. Evan, you kind of did that with E4. Can you talk a little bit about what a teacher has to do to make their own table?
Sure. Thank you. Excited to be here. I think this connects back to your first question for me as well, which is how do we systematize this? Because currently, and when you read through this book, as you all should, you'll find that you've probably heard most of the names in here before, or if you live in the teacher voice space or teacher leadership space, lots of these names are very similar or familiar to you. And that shows me that it's not systematized at all, that even though you don't have to have superpowers to do these things, it's still rare and far between for it to actually occur. And so I don't think that we can always just leave it up to teachers to find a way to make their own table. I actually think we have to force systems to do what Jason just described, which is provide structures and frameworks for leadership to flourish and to have an impact. And then I think we will see teachers begin to break down lots more of these walls. And it doesn't need to be wholly defined. I worry that if we define teacher leadership as a hybrid role where you are in the classroom 2 days a week and out of the classroom 3 days a week and only allowed to do these 6 things during those 3 days, that's just building a new cage. Mm-hmm. I'll try to keep using that. That's just building a new cage. But what Jason's doing and what he described is like, we're going to create some structures and say, you create what you need in your building, what you need across the district, what you want to see, and then we're going to figure out what works, and we'll try to figure out how to systematize those different pieces. So what we did at E4E, and the reason we felt like we had to come together outside of the system to begin meeting, was because there wasn't a seat at the table. But I don't expect teachers everywhere to do that. It was exhausting. It was lots of weekends. It was lots of nights. It was really hard to do. And so we're trying to find ways at Educators for Excellence to create those tables for teachers to begin this process, provide them some of the tools and resources both described in here and in other places so that they can tell the system in a much more solutions-oriented, sort of forward-thinking way. Here's what we would like to see and why. So I think we built these tables outside for teachers, but we don't want to continue doing it outside of the system. We really want to see systems, districts, states, the federal government keep thinking about ways to create that.
So Marilyn, you're currently still teaching?
Yes and no.
Yes and no. Okay, so explain to us what that means for you, yes and no.
So I was a middle school reading and writing teacher last year, and principal, I had a child. I didn't want to put myself in that position to have to figure out who's going to get the bulk of my attention. So I wanted teacher leadership roles, so to speak. That wasn't offered to me, but a role to be the alumni relations manager at my school was offered, and I wasn't quite sure what that meant, and I was very suspicious about that because I didn't want to plan pizza parties, as like reunions all the time. So what it turned out to be is actually a very powerful role because I'm designing it myself. It is where I follow our graduates, and they've all been my kids since 4th and 5th grade, and now they're in high school. And so I follow up with them in high school. I make sure they're graduating on the path toward graduation. Several of the students have dropped out of school. Some young ladies have had babies. So I'm working with them to get them back on track. And that's our way of contributing to the success rate for high school graduation for our students. And without that role, I wonder where some of the kids that I have been able to help would have been. And I think I needed my leader at the school to open my eyes to that being a possibility as a teacher, because I was confined to no, I love teaching in the classroom. And I want to be in the classroom. I just want to lead and help other teachers be good teachers. But in this role, and I say part-time because I do help teachers, I do sub at my school when needed, and I don't mind it because when I'm in the classroom and I'm subbing, I'm teaching. I'm not just subbing. And I leave the kids with something that they didn't have before. So I just I'm seeing the cage busting. I feel like the job that I have right now is definitely a way for me to bust out of that cage. And I felt very guilty about leaving the classroom because I felt like I wasn't I wasn't a bona fide teacher anymore. It was so hard to just kind of let that paradigm kind of shift. But seeing kids who've dropped out and enrolling them, driving them to different high schools and saying, can you please take this child, and advocating for them, I think is a part of education. And these roles and these systems need to kind of start growing, because we see that in the classroom, the way we have it now, things are still falling through the cracks. Kids are still falling through the cracks. And so I don't know if that completely answered your question about what I'm doing now, but
I think so. I like the way you said you weren't sure what the role was, and so you made the role what you wanted it to be. And that is teacher leadership right there. And you did it focused on the needs of the students. Exactly. And so that's what made it successful.
And I'm flexible. My schedule is flexible. So now I told my new principal, I would like to have a week off. I want to work 4 days a week, and I will work longer hours 2 of these days, and I will work from home 3 hours a week. I promise. But I just need a day off. I need to take care of other things, and he's fine with that because I wrote a proposal, and I have outlined everything that I need to do, and I need a cell phone. I hope he's watching this because I'm asking him. I need a cell phone because the kids nowadays, they want you to text them. They don't really want you calling them. They want you on Facebook, and I can't have 160 kids calling me on my cell phone. So that's an aside, but that's a part
but
of the...
Send him the link to the video, he'll get it.
Exactly.
That's right.
Can I just build on something she just said? So
You're going to give her a phone. You're from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Take it. So Marilyn sort of highlights a need that you saw, which, and I think you probably have a real skill in to sort of to address these students. And so I think one of the things I think the book does a nice job of, sometimes we think about teacher leadership, we think just in terms of leadership for the purpose of responding to a problem, responding to a barrier. As opposed to, and that's really important, leadership in response to a set of assets that I have, right? Yep. Opportunities that I see to impact my practice and other people's practice and really push both myself professionally forward as well as the school forward. And I think that's something that you alluded to nicely in what you tried. It wasn't necessarily just a problem, but something that you felt that you could actually fill a gap in going forward.
Well, and two, you had a plan. You had a plan. We're really, really good as educators at, complaining about what the governor, the Congress, the school board made us do. It's like, well, this is so stupid. Anyone with 2 brain cells to rub together would know that this is not going to work. And it's really, really fun to do that around the lunch table, on third lunch. And I can do that like nobody's business. But when you're actually saying, so what would be better? What would be better? If you're not willing to step forward and say, without anyone's permission, we could do this. There's some things that take resources and staff and time, and you always will need the advocates. You will always need, by the way, like the National Education Association, for instance, you'll need some organization to go up and say to a governor, to a Congress, this is what we need. But in the meantime, some kid's going to sit in that classroom tomorrow. And you need to be able to, you can't tell that kid's parent. In like 5 years, we're going to really have our, the resources we need to do something for your kid. It's like tomorrow. And you had a plan. You said, here's something I can propose. I've seen some amazing things as I take school tours in Connecticut. A school failing on a whole lot of levels. West Side Middle School in Waterbury, Connecticut, was about to have its doors closed, I think, and basically their local association president came up and said, we can keep this school open if we can come up with a better plan. And their plan was to engage parents. Their plan was to learn from each other. Their plan was a really positive restorative justice discipline approach to kids fighting on the playground. And they came up with it when they finally went, you mean you'd really do this? It didn't take any more money to have a better discipline approach for those kids. And when they saw the kids responding to that, it gave them hope that, well, we could actually do something with literature and good children's novels and put the basal, boring thing over here. They were making decisions that didn't cost a dime. And they were making them collaboratively. And the more they saw their kids responding and actually improving, the more they wanted to do more. There is some secret sauce here in collaboration, in authority, and in having your own plan. You will do things that you would be calling your union to file a grievance for if a principal made you do that, because you are staying up till 11 o'clock at night doing things, and you're doing it with a smile on your face because it's your plan. You want it to succeed. And that's what I've seen firsthand.
Jason, I'd be really interested. Your perspective is kind of interesting because here you were a great classroom teacher, you were a recognized National Teacher of the Year. Now you're working in a school system. What would you go back with the knowledge that you have now? What would you go back and tell the Jason from 10 years ago that he should be doing differently to be more successful?
You did a great job. Oh gosh. I honestly, I don't know exactly what I would say. Other than maybe just words of encouragement. Look, teaching is so extraordinarily hard. And being a great teacher, particularly in a high poverty setting, is, I would argue, one of the hardest things any human being could ever do. And seeing it done well is just magical. I mean, it is a true thing of beauty. And so, yeah, I think what I would say is keep at it, keep working at it.
Jason,
yeah.
but to build on that, I mean, so for instance, the work that you've done, that you and Kaya have done around DC Impact and teacher evaluation in DC has gotten a lot of attention. Oftentimes in the national conversation, it's either heralded as this is a really good job technically of how to evaluate teachers and use these systems, or it's attacked as dehumanizing, is problematic, is too reliant on simple metrics. I'm curious, how do you think about that in light of this conversation? Creating new opportunities, roles, thinking about teachers more expansively. How does that connect with the work you guys are doing to manage the DC teacher workforce?
Well, I think at its most basic level, even sort of contemplating some of the things that we've done comes from that sort of cage-busting ethos that we could do things differently, that we can pay teachers $125,000, and we do. So I think that whole sort of mindset of what could be, or just asking why does it have to be this way? Could it be differently? I think is so central to that. I guess where I was going, and if this isn't totally responsive, cut me off and tell me you're good at that. Given the challenges of the position, I think one of the things that we sometimes forget is that having people who are constantly sort of asking this question of how do I do this a little bit differently? What just because I was trained a certain way, or these are sort of the rules, is there another way to tackle this? And I think schools are generally these very conservative places, and teachers are sort of taught to be very compliant, and there's like a hierarchy, and there's what you can do and what you can't do, and lots of rules and all that sort of thing. And I think as a system leader, what I think a lot about is as we hire teachers, as we train teachers, as we evaluate teachers, as we support teachers, to continue to foster that spirit of, we don't have all the answers. Not that it's on you, the teachers, to figure everything out, but to have the humility to know that the best ideas don't sit in my head or in a small group of people's head in the central office, and that the way we've created so many of these policies is not out of my brain, but out of consultation and discussion and thinking with lots of people who were saying, what about if you did it this way? And we continue to change and continue to iterate on that. And I think that's how it's sort of most influenced me as I think about policy.
So Lily, when we talk a lot about systems, I mean, a lot of people look at NEA as, the big be all end all of systems, right? Over 3 million members, you're all over the place. What is NEA's responsibility and role in promoting teacher leadership?
This is probably the most interesting thing we've talked about for a long time, because everybody's right on how important class size is in my organization and how important it is to recruit quality people, and everyone's like, yes, yes, yes. You talk about teacher leadership, and for some of our leaders who are elected leaders by position, they're leaders, and I'm one of those, it means, yes, teacher leadership means on the local level that we want the local president to be able to appoint 3 teachers to the textbook selection committee or something like that. It's empowering the association on the local level or the state level or the national level. What we're talking about now sometimes makes people very uncomfortable, our own leaders, because we're saying, what's your role, local leader, state leader, national leader, in making sure that building professional who isn't ever going to run for anything, may never come to a union meeting, what's our responsibility in making sure their professional integrity, their professional authority is protected? And by the way, that does mean that if a collaborative group say, this is what we think our kids need, and it's outside the lines of, say, a strict contract, what's our responsibility for making sure that we are able to respond to that by saying, then we need to look at a contract that allows for what you, as a professional in that building, want to do, that may be very, very different than the school across the street. And
actually, that's what I've heard back from some teachers is we tried to lead, and the union told us we couldn't do what we wanted to do, which I'm a union goon. That's really frustrating to me when I hear that.
Well, and, I got to be Teacher of the Year for Utah, the same flawed character that I got to be the NEA president is because it's really hard to tell me what to do, because I have this rebellious streak that go, oh, you're not the boss of me. And when I was in my 6th grade and I had an idea to do something, and even my own friends would say, but you can't. Really? let's find, and you, who said so? And let me call them. And like Rick was saying, you find out that really it's a myth that they can't. And then you do. And people went, well, I want to be a part of that. It's what we're doing now. Right now, there's some hard discussions, but as we find more and more places that have actually said, I see my role as the association leader, making sure that you have what you need, including the flexibility in the structure that you teach in, where you can try something that's totally different, where you can take a risk with your colleagues. Why shouldn't that be my role to support you? And as we see more and more people taking that risk, not that it always necessarily ends like Disneyland, professionals in the same building can have very different ideas. Collaboration doesn't mean that you all hold hands and everybody's happy. It can mean some really hard conversations about you need to see what you're doing, and we need to see how we're supporting each other. And sometimes there's a weak link in that chain. And it's the collaboration that sometimes shows that weak link, and that can be tough, but it's worth it. It's worth taking that risk.
Well, and if we can't truly call ourselves a profession unless we're willing to be the quality control guardians of our own profession. And if we're not going to have those conversations and be willing to call that out, then I don't think we have the right to call ourselves a profession. My 2 bits. So, Irvin, tell me, Gates gets a lot of crap. Can I say that on camera? Too late. From a lot of teachers.
You just did.
Yeah. From a lot of teachers who think that you're just trying to close down the public schools and buy it out. So why do you care? Why does Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation care about teacher voice? Why would they want to give voice to teachers?
Yeah, so we have a saying at the foundation, nobody knows teaching like teachers. I fundamentally believe it. It's hard to control what people think about the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I didn't come to the foundation to completely shape how people think about the foundation. The foundation's involved in a lot of great work. So I try not to worry too much about how people perceive us and just make sure that we do the work that we know we're committed to doing. So I came to the foundation, just tell you a brief story. I came to the foundation about 4 years ago. I've taught for 15 years, loved it with a passion. Taught English, literature, AP, International Baccalaureate, regular English, and directed a choir. As a matter of fact, before we're done here, if I could just get you to sing a little bit, I'd be so happy. So I did that in an urban high school in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, 15 years, loved it, and was a principal, and after that, and then went on to do the work in district leadership. And so I was really on my way to becoming a superintendent. That's one of the things that I aspired to do. In some ways, I still look forward to doing that job one day. But the reason why I took a detour to the Gates Foundation is because there was all this stuff around teaching happening in the national dialogue. And I, to be really honest, I thought that the dialogue was a bit unhealthy, right? Having been in that profession, I just didn't think it was the right dialogue around the profession. I felt like the profession needed to be pushed, given my 15 years of experience. I thought, yeah, some of this is good. But there was like rancor. And it's hard to do great work with kids with rancor, right? And so I said, well, Irvin, you can be an observer of this, or you can jump in to a player who has some influence in this field and make sure that the rancor comes down and you really do whatever you can with the team at the foundation, phenomenal team at the foundation, to really elevate the voice of teachers, elevate the practice of teaching in a powerful way. And so that's the way I sort of come into this space. It's one of the reasons why we're doing so many things at the foundation. And of course, people sometimes have their views of that. But
Irvin, why do you think the rancor has gotten so intense?
Well, I think one reason is because not only do 3.3 million teachers have a perspective on teaching, but hundreds of millions of people have a perspective on teaching, having experienced it in this country. So everyone has a perspective. Everybody, if I were to ask you real quick, which I'm going to do, I'm going to do a poll. How many people can think of a teacher in their lives who like really impacted you in a amazingly positive way? Raise your hand. That is pretty much everybody in the room. That's one of the reasons. And if you did that at a football stadium, people would raise their hand. So everyone has perspective, and consequently, everyone feels like they should contribute, right? And so that's one of the reasons why I think there's a lot of. But in terms of the rancor itself, to answer your specific question, I think in some ways it's because some of the policies that are being pushed forward are really pushing on the profession and the way it's existed for years, right? They're really pushing on that. Teacher evaluation systems, multiple measures of effective teaching study, transforming professional development. We spend in this country $19 billion, let me repeat, $19 billion on professional development. I challenge you to find 10 teachers who say it's like phenomenal PD, right? But we continue to spend that money. So when you start having conversations about those powerful levers that impact the profession, you're going to have people staking out positions. And so I think that's one of the reasons why you have the rancor. So elevating, celebrating effective teaching in teachers, which you pull out in the book. You did. So can we just do this real quick? You referred to shout out. So when I was a teacher, I used to have students do shout out when someone was struggling with something they really overcame. I'd say shout out, and everybody would repeat shout out. So I'm going to my teaching days. If you don't mind, just do that with me. Just indulge me, please. So I'm going to say shout out, and you're going to repeat shout out. Everybody in the room, shout out.
Shout out.
That's pretty good, although my kids would be a lot louder than that. So one of the things that I love about this book is how you focus on organizations, groups that don't oftentimes think alike, but you find something positive about the way they're doing the work. I think that's really powerful. And I think so much the rancor, there's too much divisiveness. And this book tries to bring everybody and to highlight some of the things that they're doing well. So I think that's really, really positive. Elevating and celebrating effective teaching in teachers is something that we try to do at the foundation, plus many different efforts to really elevate the voice of teachers, elevate their practice, bring them together, connect with one another. I'm not sure if I really answered your question, but I did talk for a while.
Almost sounds like a politician in that. No. So we're gonna, as you can tell, I could keep asking all of them questions over and over, but I'm gonna stop and give everybody in the audience a chance to ask a few questions. So if you have a question you would like to ask Rick or one of our panelists, would you raise your hand and we will come around to you with the microphone.
And as always, we're going to ask that folks please be kind enough to identify yourself by name and affiliation, and that you actually ask a question. If we get 15 seconds in and no questions in sight, we'll give somebody else a chance.
I will do my best teacher move where I will start saying, remember, this is how we ask a question, not how we tell a story. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for your panel. I'm Barry Stern. I'm a senior advisor to what's called the Haberman Educational Foundation, to select teachers and principals who will persist and succeed with urban kids and to have them teach curricula that are worth teaching. A long time ago, Dr. Haberman figured out that next to social class, having great teachers, having great principals was the greatest predictors of success in schools, particularly for at-risk kids. At the same time, he sat in a lot of high school classrooms, and he said, I don't think that factory model design is going to work very well. How come we don't have teachers working in teams and collaborating in real time, as opposed to closing the classroom door and getting together when they're exhausted after school to try to do some planning? How do you guys feel about changing the factory model? Do you think that's feasible? Would teachers like you want to teach in teams, or would you prefer to close the classroom door?
You can give me a membership form, okay? Because that's exactly, we still have this model that says we're in these little isolated cubicles. And I didn't know what was going on across the hall, let alone in another school. Collaboration is the secret sauce.
If I could just add one thing, I think sometimes there's like a fad in education, and it used to be cooperative groups. And you'd go into classrooms and you see like kids around the table, but they're all doing their own things. And so my one cautionary note is, while I think team work and team teaching is important, as long as we're just thoughtful about exactly what are we doing, because just throwing teachers together doesn't make better teaching. And I've seen that happen time and time and time again. So my only word as we travel down that path.
Let me piggyback on that. I mean, and I think that caution can be applied broadly. It not only applies to collaboration in teams. I think it should apply to hybrid roles. I think it should apply to how we think about new job descriptions. Well, like Matt, I think it was Maddie who said earlier, there's this tendency to get a lot of folks together in education, practitioners or policy types, and people come up with 1,000,001 ideas and solutions, and they may or may not actually do anything to address the issue. Look, we've got schools that were built to do a certain thing. Mostly they were built so that you could pay women a third of what you paid men to sit a lot of Catholic immigrant children in a schoolhouse in the 1840s so that they could read the King James Bible for a long stretch. That's not necessarily the optimal design principle for a 21st century school for all kids. What I think we're struggling, and what you heard Jason talking about and Lily talking about and Irvin talking, is what does it look like to figure out how to create great teaching and learning in great schools in the 21st century? And the answer is nobody really knows. And it probably looks different for different kids, and it looks different if you've got a ton of teacher talent applying to your school, or if you're working in an area where it's much tougher to recruit teachers. And rather than us getting as excited as we do about the flavor of the month, whether it's online learning or team-based learning or anything else, what I would love, for me, what's at the heart of this book is letting the question of what does it look like to create great teaching and learning, great classrooms, great schools, great online learning opportunities, whatever. What's it look like to let that steer us and to let everything else be driven by the question of how do you do that? And I don't think anybody knows as much about what makes for great teaching and learning for a group of kids as those kids' parents and those kids' teachers. And so for me, what we need to do is get over some of the policy arrogance that has infected so much of this conversation about what worked in one place and how do we, from a state capital, mandate it or mimic it, and how do we get much more humble about how do we create conditions, allow educators and families to create the right kinds of places of learning for those kids, but then expect them to be accountable. And if they're not serving those children well, then we need to take steps. But it seems to me that, part and parcel of the fadism is this notion that we need to know the right answer and we need to be able to superimpose it.
But let me just push back a little bit on that. To go back to your premise on collaboration, the places that we've seen some real breakouts, and especially not only in schools that are struggling, but I've also been visiting, like, where are those high-performing schools that have everything and the hover parents and McMansions, and everything. And when you do what you've suggested, there's a problem or we've got an opportunity or whatever it is, whenever we've seen something really in the breakout, that busting cage. Are we all supposed to say that before we leave? I think we don't get to leave till we say cage busting 3 times. But good plan, Rick. But inevitably, it came down to having those professionals say, here's what it would look like to improve our math, to improve our arts department, whatever it was. And the plan was always collaborative. So, organically, they said, and we'll come together, and this is as they developed a design, it was by nature collaborative. It wasn't someone saying, all right, we're all going to do collaboration today from 9 to 10. It was in service to a purpose of improving something for kids, and collaboration inevitably, organically became the structure.
So, and I would just say, it's nice to have this moment of comedy. Lily and I agree on very little most of the time.
Very little.
So, and I actually totally buy that. And in fact, it seems to me that if we aren't caught up in habits and routines and what we're used to, that not only does it seem to me to make sense that great teaching and learning in the 21st century is going to have a lot of collaboration, is kind of a natural component in a lot of cases. I also think teacher jobs going to naturally be redesigned in lots of cases, like Jason's. I think online learning and digital tools will naturally be integrated in a lot of ways. So I don't think that the things that we get excited about, I don't think it's wrong to get excited about them. But I think what happens is we say, I'm a collaboration person or I'm a digital learning person, instead of making sure that the horse is before the cart.
And
Yeah.
Evan?
the other thing that I think was very clear in this book is when teachers come up with great ideas, and I will say we work with teachers all over the country now, and there's lots of really bad ideas that they come up with as well. Just like there are lots of really good ideas. And so just being a teacher doesn't mean you innately have all of the answers. I often have to remind myself that too. I was a teacher. It doesn't mean I know everything that is right in schools. But what these teachers did, and one story jumps out at me, Jeff Austin's story, where like he came to his principal and said, here's this idea we have. We want to work collaboratively across the 11th grade and intertwine our curriculum. And here's the results that I think it's going to have for our kids at the end of the year. And then after he showed the principal that this worked, then they said, okay, we're going to do this and we're going to form an academy within the high school. And we're going to demonstrate the results at the end of another year where now we're doing this with more kids. And now Jeff Austin and a team of teachers started a pilot school and launched it in Los Angeles and are doing really amazing things with a whole school of kids. But along the way, they kept checking themselves and saying, is this working? How do we know if it's working? And that sort of research-based practice is not happening enough in schools. And I think that's what teachers really need to do to earn the leadership that you were describing, is they need to not only say, here are some ideas that we think will work, they need to be bold enough to stand up at the end of the year and say, and look, we showed you they worked, and here was the things we said we were going to do, and we hit those goals. And I'm not saying there's only one way to measure those goals. There's lots of ways to measure them. But it certainly needs to be demonstrating that kids are somewhere that you said you were going to take them, and they're doing things differently as a result of your work. And so I think that's one thing that I saw clearly in this book, whether it's collaboratively or with online learning, is you have to show that kids are somewhere different because of what you did.
I wanted to add to the discussion, my experience working in some of the poorest neighborhoods of Chicago where violence is a daily experience for even the youngest child. There is a realm that we often don't talk about in education, which is like the social emotional and spiritual like level of stability in the community. A lot of kids have post-traumatic stress syndrome. Some of the teachers have post-traumatic stress syndrome, seeing their former students die and going to funerals, burying your own student. And so what Irvin said earlier was teachers have to find their voice and find their passion and use those to cage bust. I said it. And the book, I feel like, has a lot of practical ways you can do that. And I would like to share one way that I've been able to do it, and not even knowing, like, I'm cage busting. No, this was, like, right when I started teaching, you know? I was working at a school near an area project, like 99% low income, and I was finding a lot of teachers struggling, running to the bathroom in tears, breaking up fights, and like chaos all around. Instructional support was like non-existent, and you know, I'm a new teacher. I'm like, my class was actually quite okay. Not perfect, but because my passion, I have a passion for relationships with people, and I love people. I love to love on people and encourage people. And I have a faith in God. My idea was, you know what? I'm praying every day. I'm going to ask this teacher who's crying every day if, I can pray for her. And like I said, I know there's a church-state separation. I understand that. But part of my cage busting, I said it twice, was that I actually called lawyers and talked to them, and I investigated. And I said, what can I do and what can I not do? And I got like you said, there's a lot of things you can do if you just ask. And the law is basically saying you cannot pray with students, you cannot talk about God with students, whatever, but your colleague, you're good to go. And as long as you don't do it during school hours, before school, after school. So what I did was I invited a friend to pray with me, and she's like, oh my God, this is so great, I love it. This helps me, because if you have a broken teacher in a classroom, you can't do anything. One teacher, and over time it just grew and grew and grew, and from school to school. So one teacher said, you know, when I go home, I get punched in the face by my husband. When I go, another teacher said, I'm waiting on test results, I might have cervical cancer. And these are teachers who are teaching difficult situations. So teachers have hard lives sometimes. One teacher said, I am going through an eviction, and right now I'm living in a hotel. I've been living in a hotel for 3 weeks with my kids. All kind of crazy things. And so what I'm trying to say is not saying that everybody should have a Teachers Who Pray chapter, which that would be wonderful if you did. But what I'm saying is your passion and your voice and your relationships will take you to help your school in ways that you didn't even imagine. And there's one teacher, he was studying to become a teacher in my classroom, and I didn't know this, but he was being treated for a cancerous tumor in his leg. And he thought he might not survive. And all these things. And then when I talked to him, he was like, I would love for you to pray for me. He's like, I don't even go to church. I don't know. But I would take anything right now because he's falling apart. So all I'm saying is, we look at policy, we talk about collaboration and all those things, but at the end of the day, we're all human. Mm-hmm. And so so my passion is relationships, which makes the alumni job perfect for me. And I love mothering on kids. But whatever you do as a teacher that you are passionate about, do it. You don't always have to have a permission from a principal, and so I just wanted to share that story. I have a lot, but
Every teacher has so many stories.
yeah, exactly.
Actually, Jason, I guess a question on a related note for you. I mean, one of the things I've been struck by in the last, say, 6 months is a number of emails I've gotten from teachers that say, what you don't understand, Rick, is, I've tried to think this way, I've tried to talk this way, I've tried to be constructive, and they have the sheer number of horror stories that folks are sharing about my principal simply doesn't want to hear it. I tried to speak up and I got fired. I don't know if what they're sharing is all the details of the situations or not, but there's certainly a thread of that out there. You're somebody who has been on both sides as a classroom teacher and administrator. Are there suggestions or thoughts for teachers who are struggling with some of the stuff Marilyn's talking about on how to reach out to administration in a constructive or useful way to address things that might be problematic?
That was for me. I think one of the things that we haven't talked a lot about is that great leadership creates the space for cage-busting people to bust. Oftentimes when we talk about teachers, we sort of forget to talk about leadership and principles. And I know you have another book about that, but I do think this is powerful. I think, our traditional preparation of principals doesn't spend a lot of time talking about what does it mean to actually talent manage? What does it actually mean to be humble enough to know that you don't actually have to have all the answers, that it's not a threat to your authority to have somebody say, hey, here's a totally different way to do this. I went to my principal and said, I literally cannot move my kids 3 years of math in 1 year, but if you let me double the amount of time I have with them, I might have a shot at it. He's like, great, here's the schedule. If you can figure out a way to do it, let's go. And I think that humility and that openness was so powerful. And so that is very explicitly something that we talk to principals about, train them on, and focus on to allow this to happen. I think on the other side of the coin, sometimes the ideas aren't so great. And sometimes there's a lack of recognition of the complexity of the levers and budgets and whatnot. Now, I'd rather people push and, it gets messy and then you kind of have to figure out the right equilibrium. But I think there's a little bit of that too that we need to consider.
And
Sure,
so
Evan.
my first attempt at cage busting, I was a new 6th grade teacher. I taught in a pre-K to 6th grade school. And my mentor teacher always talked to me about how she only loved teaching. Her passion was teaching English language arts and social studies and integrating the two together. But we taught in self-contained classrooms, so everybody taught every subject. And I was like, well, this week I'm much better in the math and sciences. That's what I studied. Let's split this up. We have 13 classrooms on each grade level. It was a massive elementary school, just about 2,000 students. And I said, so we can departmentalize this. And we went to the principal and said, let us departmentalize the 6th grade. And he was like, well, come to me with a plan. Just saying we want to do this is like, that's a huge project. The bells change, everything changes. The stairways, you have to go a certain direction. If you go the wrong direction, it's chaos. And so we did. We wrote a whole plan. We spent weeks on it. And we came to him, and he read it through, and he gave it a lot of thought. But he said no. He said, this has huge effects on the whole building, on the lunch schedule, on the bus schedules. We wanted to change so much that it didn't work. And so at the end of the day, we had to say, okay, this didn't work. What are some of the other options? But it's almost like teachers often say, trust me to teach, trust me to lead. And I think we also need to trust our leaders. They need to earn that trust and maintain it. But we need to trust them that they are trying to do the right thing. At E4E, we have 3 rules that we bring to every conversation. And the first is assume best intentions, right? Everybody's in that building because they really want to do good things. The second rule is ensure all voices are heard. So step up and step back and actually listen. And I think great principals do that, great teachers do that. And then the third is this stay solutions oriented. So when our principal told us no, we didn't go back to the teacher's lounge and say, he's a tyrant, he's terrible. We said, well, could we do it on a smaller scale? Could just between our 2 classrooms, could we switch kids back and forth? And continued to find ways to do that. So I think those 3 rules, we live by them at E4E, and I would encourage others to do them as well because they are very helpful in creating an environment where people can bust down the cages.
Okay, great. I have another question here, and then we'll move to the back of the room.
Hi, I'm Segun Eubanks with the National Education Association. And so much you talk, Rick, the book kind of tells a whole variety of stories. But often when I hear about cage busting and teacher leadership, it's about kind of busting the cage in your classroom and going across the hall or inside the school. When we know that real education and real education change happens in the places that control the policy, the systems, and the money, which means busting the cages of the school boards and the state houses and those kinds of places. How would you recommend that teacher voice not only happens inside the school, but in the state house and in the school board and in Capitol Hill right now when they're trying to reauthorize the SEA and other places?
And you're also a school board president, so, right? Yeah, there you go.
So I think one of the things the book does a nice job is actually highlighting organizations like E4E and Teach Plus and Viva and traditional organizations, NEA and others that actually help teachers to do that, right? So it's a little more difficult to do it individual teachers alone, but to work with other teachers to allow yourself to be trained by those who are really good at getting you ready to impact those policies and collaborate with policymakers. I think there's just more organizations that teachers can connect with that can help them do that. And one of the things that we've been really excited about at the foundation is seeding some of those organizations, helping those organizations to thrive and go to different places all across the country so that they're in a position to help teachers do exactly that. And I think the book, again, does a nice job of actually giving particular strategies and examples of teachers who are doing that in a powerful way.
I think Segun actually was a terrific kind of thought partner in some of the books. So thank you, pal. One story from the book that stuck with me is some of y'all know Lynn Gaddis, who was Illinois Teacher of the Year back in the 1990s, and she talks about she organized about I don't know, half a dozen or more of Illinois' State Teachers of the Year, and they wanted to have teacher voice heard in the state. So they reached out to the State Commissioner of Education, and they said, can we get a meeting? We want to sit down and talk with you because we don't feel like we're being heard. And so they got their meeting, and they sat down with him. And he said, all right, well, what are we here for? And they said, we want to be heard. And he said, okay, what do you got? And she's like, we actually hadn't kind of worked past that. We were just eager to be heard. And so I think this is a lot of it. I want teachers engaged in policy because I think a lot of our policy conversations feel remarkably divorced from the way stuff really plays out. But I think teachers, there's a couple places that I think teachers can really get it right. One is teachers need to know what are they talking about in the policy that is a policy problem. So you'll talk to Capitol Hill staff. They'll have a delegation of teachers come in, and it's somebody who has been lead education for the Senate Majority Leader or the House Senate Committee Chair or the House Committee Chair. And you talk to the committee chair, and they'll say, yeah, the teachers came in, and they had really good complaints, but none of it's federal policy. It's either the way it's being implemented by the state, or it's actually something their district's doing. And we told them that, but they didn't really believe us. And it wasn't a productive. So one is teachers have just got to know where is that problem, which is why I encourage thinking about it at the school level first, because once you know where that problem's coming from, then you know what to take to the district and what to take to the state. That's the first thing. The second thing is teachers need to show up with, Irvin mentioned this, that policy is a crude tool. You'll often be in meetings with teachers of legislators, and they'll talk about terrific programs at their school. They'll talk about how they need more resources. If legislators had more resources to give, they're usually pretty happy to give them. They're excited about your program, but they can't legislate a program because when they do, it no longer works, and then everybody says, "Oh, what happened?" So what they want is they need teachers to offer suggestions that work well in a policy context. And then the third is, you'll hear a lot from teachers that these folks, they think they know about schools because they were students once, or they don't really understand this, or they're thinking, and I understand frustration, but the flip side of it is these folks, public officials, are elected to do a job. You're on the school board because your job is to serve the citizens of Prince George's County. And teachers need to respect that there's actually a lot of really boring stuff that goes with what you're doing. There's meetings you don't want to be at. There's stuff that you would rather not have to worry about. And so they need to show up with that. Now, with the flip side is I think advocates and policymakers and even a lot of these intermediary groups have way too often been dismissive of teachers. They get frustrated with teachers. They feel like these 27-year-olds who got a master's degree are the people doing the real work. And if we just write policy right in an advocacy context, the rest will take care of itself. So it's not all on one side. But I think teachers need to worry about what they can control, and then find the folks who are going to work constructively on the other side of that table.
Let's take a question from the back of the room.
Hi, my name is Steve Wojciechowicz. I work for the American Federation of Teachers here in DC. And my question is about sustainability of a system that would promote cage busting. There, I said it too. And the question comes from this. Teachers who are working in schools where teachers mostly work alone probably attended schools where teachers mostly work alone, and were probably trained at schools where teachers mostly work alone. So even if you create a structure where collaboration can happen, they may not have any model for what collaboration looks like or can look like. And I'm wondering, is there professional development training out there that looks like that? Is there a will to create that? And could it be funded?
I know one group that's doing a lot of work around that, and that's the National Network of State Teachers of the Year, that's developed some fabulous models around teacher leadership. What's the history? What does it mean? And how do you actually do this in your classroom? How do you lead your colleagues? Because there's a big difference between leading my class of sixth graders or kindergartners and leading a group of adults. And if I try to lead the group of adults the same way, they're going to flog me, right? So they're really working on that, and they've developed modules around that they are taking out to anybody who wants them.
Well, and it has to be a part of your teacher prep too. You can't start too early, and the models are out there. We could actually NEA is actually has a teacher leadership initiative now where we're training our own members to be trainers of trainers as they go out there and start sowing those seeds that say, can you reimagine what it looks like to take what you can control? Because you're right, people are often saying, our own members, until I have this technology, this class size, this, until there's rainbows in My Little Ponies, then, I can't imagine doing something different. And what we're finding is when you put them together with very creative people, everyone has to be a good professional and know what they're doing. But as you put those good professionals together, a synergy will often, more often than anyone expected, will occur. And you'll start saying, I can manipulate these parts of instructional design and selection of materials and discipline and parent engagement and things that really do move the needle. But if they're just left to spontaneously generate all of this without any chemical reaction that can come in from the outside, it's not necessarily going to happen. And so you have organizations like AFT and NEA that are building teacher leadership. We're now working with a lot of the colleges of education, saying, how do we bring this? But if you end up preparing the next generation of teachers and plunking them down in situations where the expectation is you're going to just be in your room, close the door, it has to happen together. It has to be systemic.
It reminds me of the question we had before when we were in the other room meeting with teachers, and I asked the teachers, if you could wave your magic wand and create the perfect day, what would it be? And one of the people said, well, we'd have collaborative plan time, and we'd be meeting as a team and doing things as a team. And I said, well, what's your day like now? And he said, well, we have collaborative plan time, but we never meet, we never talk to each other.
Right.
So you have to do more than just create the condition. You have to be intentional, very intentional about the work.
One of my favorite professional development sessions that I went to was on differentiation, and it was a 90-minute PowerPoint presentation on how to differentiate instruction. And I was like, the irony of this is just priceless, that we're all sitting in a room being differentiated to the same way. But I do think that there are a really integral set of skills around facilitation and how to run discussion groups and how to measure progress and all of these things that aren't taught at all in teacher preparation. And there are lots of groups trying to do that. But I also think we can't wait until we have all of those things perfect either. And so do think we need to be talking to teachers about how to set agendas, how to come in with clear discussion questions and run groups. And it's also not complete rocket science, and it's something that we can build into the day. But I do think this is one of those things that needs to start with districts and principals to make sure that they're modeling the type of work that we want teachers to be doing collaboratively together.
Although, and not all of this has to be, we tend to make a big deal out of this. One, look, if you've got a school that's serving kids terrifically and teachers like kind of minding their own business, that's okay by me, at least. I think the point here is to serve the kids well and to let professionals create professional environments to let them do their best work. And all professionals don't necessarily do their best work the same way. But Evan, also, there's a great story in the book that you shared from kind of early on where a mentor helped you kind of think about strength of numbers and collaboration, not in a way of we're all kind of visiting each other's classrooms every day, but that we're organizing to accomplish something for a kid. Maybe you want to just share that?
Sure. I had an incredible student who came into my 6th grade classroom years behind in math, had gone to summer school every year, passed the much easier exam and been pushed through the system. But he was a joy to have in the classroom, came to my Saturday school, came to my after-school program, and it became clear that he needed a 504, he needed extended time, he computationally could do the work, or he understood the concepts, but computationally it just took him longer. So we worked with him, we got him a 504. For the first time ever, he passed the math exam at the end of the year. It was a big celebration. His mom made everybody empanadas for weeks. It was like the whole floor smelled like empanadas. It was awesome. And the next year, he came back and his face was streaked with tears because they were no longer giving him extended time. And I thought, not a big deal. I sent the metal fireproof box to the central office. I'm sure it made it to where it was supposed to go with your forms in it. So I have copies. I'll take it over to PS 244, which was a block and a half away. Went and waited probably 2 hours for the principal to see me. I only got to see her because on our way out, I was sort of blocking the pathway to the door. And she knew I was there, and she said, there's nothing we can do. He's in middle school now. He needs to keep up. And I was like, this is his legal right. And I had some other choice words that were not effective at getting accomplished what I wanted to get accomplished. And the next day, I was really still upset about this, visibly upset. And one of my mentor teachers, Jen Lee, who was fantastic, said, like, Stone, what is wrong with you? Look like you've been crying at your desk. And I told her the story. And she said, well, let's go back. And I said, we can't go back. She's a tyrant. She's terrible. There's nothing we can do about it. Lots of tyrants in the system. And she said, well, let's get his second grade teacher and third grade teacher and fourth grade teacher and his resource room teacher and everybody that ate empanadas last year, and let's go back and talk to the principal. And so about 10 or 11 of us walked back there the next week, and the principal saw us immediately and said, I'm so sorry, I didn't understand what the problem was. Of course we can accommodate Saul. It is his legal right. I'll make sure that he's getting extended time. And it just showed me that oftentimes as teachers, we can do transformational things in our classroom with them. But if we actually want to change systems, teachers need to organize and put pressure on the system. And the second time I showed up, I also wasn't cursing anymore. I was there with a smile on my face saying this really needs to happen. But having 12 people made the principal realize, well, these 12 people probably know other people and the superintendent or the local education council, or maybe they know a reporter, or all of these other things that we were beginning to show power. And so I do think teachers have power and should be willing to use it to create meaningful change for kids.
Okay, let's take another question.
Hi, Joe McTighe from CAPE, the Council for American Private Education. I want to pick up on a point that Evan made earlier, because a couple of weeks ago, AEI had a conference called Moneyball for Education, essentially arguing that a lot of what we do in education is not research-based and evidence-based, and much more of it should be. My question, I guess, to anybody other than Evan is, how important do you think it is that cage-busting practice, which is essentially pioneering practice, be driven by evidence and research?
Irvin, you guys have spent a couple bucks on this.
Yeah, no, it's critical. I mean, it's just critical. And in the end, I don't think too many of us would disagree that it's ultimately about transforming the lives of students in this country, particularly, we would say, low-income minority students. And one of the best ways to determine whether that's happening is, are they learning more? Are they going to college and being successful without taking remedial courses, right? Can they create a livelihood for themselves going forward? And so that's like one of the ultimate indicators. And at some point in time, I think you have to ask the question, is what you're doing, whether it's within the cage or outside of the cage, leading to that? Vitally important. I fundamentally believe, that's why I love the book, that there's greater likelihood of you getting to that if people are working outside of the cage, particularly teachers and leaders. But to me, it has to lead to that, right? I've got kids, I want them to be successful. I taught kids, I want them to be successful. So to answer your question, vitally important at some point in time for us to be able to begin drawing some links to the impact that it's having on the lives of kids.
As long as we're measuring that 360-degree individual, because when I want to know if my kids know my fourth graders knew their times tables, 0 through 12, and I'm timing them with the stopwatch. And so there are some things that are easy to say, do you have the mechanics of this? Do you know where the period goes? Can you write a complete sentence? But Marilyn, I'm thinking about the story that you just told. You said, you said something about being human. And when we're looking at that whole, and although you were talking about your colleagues, it's the same thing, that we have to have that same heart. And I risk making it sound like I want something warm and fuzzy and like, again, My Little Pony. But there's, when I talk about the whole child, it is research-based for me, because it is academic. And academic is more than what you can put on a standardized test. It's that critical, creative mind. It's also that healthy body. And that's everything from, do they have a school nurse, and are they getting school breakfast? I taught at a homeless shelter for several years. And it was the best gig ever, because I had the most incredible wraparound services. We had a dentist in that, that came once a month. We had things that those very vulnerable families needed. I was never alone. We looked at that whole human child, and for me, probably the biggest part of it is the character that we're developing, that ethical, compassionate character. And that's what you were reaching out to with your colleagues, saying, I see you as a human being, and I see that you're a vulnerable person on your, and that's what, when there's a relationship between a parent, a student, a child that you've developed, the rest of it takes off. If you leave that out because it can't be measured and there's not a study on it, then you miss, I think, what really does move the needle on every other level.
I think also, I agree with that very wholeheartedly. In schools, I work at a charter school, so every Friday is a PD day. And like some district schools where they have like once a quarter, twice a quarter, we get it every week. So if it's bad, it's really bad, because it's really bad every week. I'm not saying that it's bad. I'm just saying if it's bad. And so I think you have to have a balance. You have to have that emotional connection with your kids, but you also have to have that research, that pedagogy. And that is, you lean either one way or the other in a lot of schools. You go hardcore data, hardcore results, and leave that person part out, or you go so warm and fuzzy person and like you're teaching nothing, like it's no rigor. And I feel like at my school, it's a lovely school, love my school. But I'm at the point now where I'm just like, we need to push the rigor a little more. We need to push the research-based practice a little more. And that's what I want all of us to go to, because one thing I think this is like an obvious statement to make, but I don't think a lot of people think this way about education. But being a teacher is a highly intellectual profession. It's highly intellectual. And I can be a kindergarten teacher or a preschool teacher and be challenged intellectually, because I'm teaching ABCs, and I've known that since I was 3, but how do I teach it to all these little people, And I think that is where the meat and the potatoes, like people just like, well, I'm vegetarian. I only want the potatoes. I don't want the meat, Or like, I'm a carnivore. I don't eat potatoes. I only eat meat. But we need the meat and the potatoes. We need to hug those little kids and rub their runny noses, but we also need to be very strategic about how we're teaching them. And when we see that there is a learning disability, not finding out in the 4th grade, So to answer your question, I think that I think with the Common Core, we're pushing more people toward that intellectual piece that was missing when I first started teaching my teaching training. But I saw it right early on, and the PD was not feeling that need in the least bit. So.
I think we have time for one or two more questions.
So true. I like the meat and potatoes.
Are you-
Go ahead.
Okay. Richard Collenberg with the Century Foundation. So I'm wondering what the whole discussion implies for the debate over teacher tenure rights. So it seems to me that if we want teachers to be cage busters, to be trying innovative things, to experiment, that's risky if you don't have tenure, if there are not protections in place for teachers. So I'm wondering, in particular, Rick, what your thoughts are, and everyone else as well.
Yeah, I'm wondering too.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, for me, the point is not to innovate. The point is to solve problems that let educators do a better job for kids. Look, I mean, I've written about tenure ad nauseum. I think tenure made a lot of sense a century ago when teachers were routinely fired because they didn't match New York State's height and weight charts, or because you know somebody thought that you were a communist sympathizer. I think in a world of Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, my wife's an employment litigator. It is enormously difficult to fire people in any organization in America today. So I think, you know, tenure is some version of tenure is appropriate. I think it ought to be much less restrictive than it is today. I think the notion that teachers need due process is entirely appropriate. The right mechanisms for ensuring that is, I think, an open question and one that we can be wrestling with.
You know, I heard an interesting quote, I don't think my mic's on, but I heard an interesting quote at the International Summit this last week, and it said, as you evaluate, so will you innovate. So if you don't have good evaluation systems that assure people the right to innovate, they won't innovate. I think that's part of what we're seeing today, is that in many poor evaluation systems, teachers are terrified to innovate, because if I make the tiniest mistake, not only will I lose my job, it'll be all over the newspaper. So we have to design a system that allows both. And I want this lady to be able to ask her.
Thank you very much. My name's Alex Fries. I'm with the Association of American Educators. We're the largest national non-union teacher association. Evan, I'm curious about just some commentary about the reform-minded teacher. We're talking a lot about broad strokes about what teachers can do, but I know personally, as a representative of, I've got one with right here with me of a reform-minded teacher, in terms of life rafts for them, and poking holes in the theory that the union doesn't speak for all teachers, because there are lots of teachers that are very frustrated with the hard-nosed agenda of the unions, quite frankly, in terms of gaining information, feeling like they have a voice. I know that your group does a lot of great work. I know our group does a lot of great work for that. But in terms of growing that reform-minded teacher voice, if you care to speak on that.
Sure. So Rick, a little while ago, sort of talked about some of these dichotomies that exist in the space. And I think one of them is that you can't be pro-union and pro-reform, that you can't be pro-union and pro-change. And what I find in most teachers is that they want to know that there is somebody that's got their back. And they appreciate that. Many of the teachers that we also work with also want to see their unions leading the charge on defining what effectiveness looks like. And they want to see their unions taking the lead on removing ineffective teachers from the classroom and ensuring that there is a streamlined process to do that, because it makes all teachers look better. And they want their union to be ensuring that they have collaborative planning time and lots of the things in place that allow them to do the work that we've been talking about. So I think at Educators for Excellence, we're really trying hard not to get stuck in that dichotomous that you're either a reformer or you're a defender of the status quo, because I don't think that's where most people are, and I know that's not where most teachers are that we talk to. We do think it's really important for unions to hear all their members, and one of the cage-busting things that I would encourage all teachers to do is start going to your union meetings, start voting in your union elections, start sitting down with your chapter chair and saying, here's what I think we need to do in our school. Because just like if you don't go to school board meetings and only 7% of people, like in Los Angeles, vote for a school board member, then those school board members are going to represent those 7% of people. Or if you're a teacher in a district like New York City, where only 17% of teachers vote in their union elections, and a majority of the votes come from retirees, then the leadership is going to represent who they're hearing from on a daily basis. So I think it's incumbent on teachers to say, if you believe deeply in your union, then you need to engage in it and participate in it. And that's something that we encourage teachers to do at E3.
I did that and ran for the president, so I agree.
Are you taking another question? I did want to address the tenure piece a little bit, because I've never had tenure. When I worked in CPS at the district school, you had to wait 4 years before you can achieve tenure, and I was fired before I could get that because I was a cage buster. And then I left that, and you can read my blog to find out more about actually what happened, but I left that school, went to a charter school, and just the leadership was cage busting leadership. They were just, so we saw eye to eye, and we were able to do innovative things. I think, looking back on my experience, if it meant a lot to me, for me, it meant more to speak up on behalf of the kids that were being left behind. And of course, I won my job, but I had to do it. It was like something I had to do. So everyone has to make their own decisions about what risk they want to take with cage busting, and it's a personal decision. However, not all, and someone said this in the room before we came here, not all cage busting is adversarial, not all of it is loud. A lot of it is welcomed because principals have a lot of pressure too, and if you can make yourself indisposable to them, then and try to work with them as much as possible, that's the goal. It's not to be a maverick and show them who's boss or whatever.
Well, I think that's actually a beautiful note for us to close, because the whole point here is that, cage busting teachers ought to be creating the schools and systems where they can do their best work. And what do leaders, what do administrators, what do administrators and policymakers want? They want schools that are serving kids well. So for me, the point here is not about controversy or about innovation. It's about what we actually, at a high level, there's a lot of room for agreement. And these are ways in which teachers can make some of this happen. Maddie, thank you so much for driving this train today.
We'd like to thank the panel for being here and for sharing your wisdom with us and broadening our knowledge of teacher leadership. And we invite all of you to join us for a reception outside.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.